live here. Let me make sure we're live on YouTube. All right, and we hit maximize button. This button. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
Today we're going to talk a little bit about metas and what makes them fun. Before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
On this podcast, we like to talk about games, okay? And since this is my topic, I'll introduce it because I think it's an interesting time, right? So right at the start of the month, we kind of had this convergence of a bunch of different things happening, right? Number one, Diablo 4 came out. We did a whole podcast on that, right? It's been a lot of what I've been playing. I'm level 75 now, trying to get to level 100. My goal is to get to level 100 before the end of the season, or not the end of the season, the start of the season, which is in mid-July somewhere. Street Fighter 6 also comes out, right? Mango's been doing a million sets and everything like that. And the third piece of news that really made this solidify in my brain is a new game mode for Hearthstone that got announced last week that is called Twist. Twist is a new ranked ladder queue, right? But one that's kind of halfway between like the traditional standard and wild and also weirdly tavern brawl. Basically, the rule is every they call it every season, which we think is every month, but it could technically be every 4 months. It might be like until the end of it could be every 4 months until the end of like a new expansion cycle. There is a twist format, and the twist format is new and includes rules that have never, before been seen in Hearthstone. So the current version of Twist that is going to be live when the game mode does go live, I think later this week, maybe. I think it goes live tomorrow. Is every set from 2020, so it's like Year of the Phoenix, Year of the Griffin, Year of the Kraken, I don't know, I think we're in Year of the Wolf, right? And the core set, but no neutral cards, right? So everything has to be a class card. Everything you put in your deck has to be a class card, which is obviously a format that we've never seen that before, right? What is that going to mean, right? And on top of all of these, I just had this like brewing thought of like, when is it fun to participate in the meta versus when is it fun to buck the meta, right? And the reason that this has been in stark relief is because specifically for Diablo, I've had a lot of conversations with friends, right, about whether or not it's more fun to play the meta versus not play the meta, right? To me, playing the meta in Diablo sounds terrible because the meta in Diablo is you play a barbarian, you roll all of your shouts one after another, and then you just start whirlwinding, and you just hold the whirlwind button for as long as you can sustain it, and then when it drops, you do that process all over again, right? Which to me sounds boring as fuck. It's like just spinning. That's it. That's how I'm going to play the game. That sounds terrible, right? But to a lot of other folks, that's what makes Barbarian fun, right? Using all these abilities kind of in tandem. You'll see that a lot of kind of quote unquote meta Diablo builds are really built around just spamming one thing and making that thing as good as possible. It seems like, at least from my experience. I was looking at necromancer builds, and the idea to make like the best necromancer build is either you go I call it the poop build because it looks like poop, where you corpse explosion and put like black goo on the ground, and that goo just deals damage, but the damage can stack. So you just generate a million corpses, detonate all of them, and then just stand there, right? That's it. You just press one and you detonate corpses and you stand in the corpses. Or is a bone spear build where you just like power up your bone spear and you just shoot bone spear over and over and over again. Seems like a lot of Diablo builds are built around use this one thing, make this one thing as good as possible. Everything else is just about building up enough stuff to do your one thing. And in the face of that, I don't want to do that, right? My build is complicated. There's like a whole rotation. I'm juggling uptime on these buffs or whatever. And that's really engaging, right? But I probably am worse than someone who's just doing like a whirlwind spam build or something like that. But then in other situations, like in Hearthstone, I've talked in the past about how I really enjoy the intricacies of playing inside of the meta, right? When I was doing my Climb to Legend with Enrage Warrior last month, that was really fun because Enrage Warrior was a meta deck, right? Um, it wasn't like I was bucking the meta. In fact, I was sort of I was part of a Vanguard. And Rage Warrior is not the best deck in the game. Sort of, not true. The best deck at high legend, if you are a good player, and most people are not playing the deck, just degenerates like me. And so what is the difference between wanting to participate in the meta versus wanting to, you know, reject the meta? That's my introductory thesis.
Yeah, no, I mean, and this has a lot of angles to it, right? Because like you laid out Diablo. Diablo has this aspect where it's basically all PvE. In fact, there's a separate PvP meta, as I understand it. I have not been playing as much Diablo before, but friend of the cast, Monic, lets me know that reliably one of the most unbeatable builds in PvP is Thorn's Barbarian. But that like obviously does not have anything to do with the PvE meta, and so there's different considerations there. There's also like this weird thing where like essentially it's a long-term character, right? So like, because like, we talk about World of Warcraft a lot on this podcast, right? There are meta talent builds for classes, but like it almost doesn't get discussed that way, right? Like it kind of gets discussed as like what are the optimal choices, which is meta, but it doesn't get called the meta, right? It gets called something else. And I think there's something there on top of like, and like like you said with Hearthstone, there's like different formulations within the same archetype that tend to be meta. We played a lot of League of Legends for a while that had metas that resolved around certain types of characters, but like let you pick different characters. Like like the tank meta meant you picked one of a handful of tanky characters, but there was still choice inside of there. And then like you said, Street Fighter comes out. Street Fighter has a slowly evolving meta. Last night, Blanca won CEO, and so people are starting to pick him up. But that's,
Wow.
it's still early game, right? So like that might just be a thing. And so I think there's a handful of things that go into this, right? Some of it is just kind of like raw, like preference / fun to play, right? If Whirlwind Barb was your favorite thing to do, buddy, like you'd probably play it, but that's outside of meta considerations, right? There's some people who are going to be attracted to meta consideration, and like it wouldn't surprise me if Whirlwind Barb is the meta right now, not solely because it's the most effective build, but just because it's also an archetype that everybody loves going back to like Diablo 2, right? Like people like playing Whirlwind Barb. True. So that archetype probably got optimized early. And then I had another point in this kind of vein, right? Like there's also like a matter of how much success matters. And this is going to sound weird, but like in a game like Diablo, right? If you were playing less than optimally because it's mostly PvE game, it's not a huge deal, right? Like it is much more, and also this is going to sound weird, but like Diablo's kind of a low skill game, right? Like there's not as much execution. Like, Rogue is pretty execution heavy. Most stuff is not, especially most of the meta builds are not execution heavy. And I might suspect that, some of the meta stuff in Diablo is based around things not being as execution heavy, which is weird for meta, but I think that might be true. Whereas like in something like Hearthstone, it's basically all execution, and in something like Street Fighter, execution is like absolutely the most important, right? Like your ability to execute is more important than like actual meta kind of considerations.
Yeah, that is probably an interest, because like there's another piece of this. For instance, the WoW thing is really interesting to me because on one hand, I feel like I buck the WoW meta, right? Because I'm playing a class that I want, right? And I, very famously played a version of Arms Warrior that made me the best in the world at that version, just because it was literally the bottom of the meta, and I was the only one willing to play it in the high end version of the game that I was participating in, right? But on the other hand, I don't participate, or I do participate in the meta because I build my warrior basically the way that the best players in the world build their warriors, right? There are some pieces where I don't, and I would probably hold on to that. Like, there's a part of me that wants to say, oh, I have like bucked the meta because I choose a handful of different talents to kind of make my build a specific kind of damage that's a little bit different from other people, even though 95% of the talents I take are the same as everybody else. My rotation's the same as everybody else. I'm using the same power talents. I'm just kind of tweaking things a little bit because I want a little more single target damage and cleave damage rather than AoE, right? And I would say that's probably a representation of me being sort of wrong about the meta, right? That I am in fact a participator in kind of like the WoW meta, and that's just, I don't know, there it's an interesting uh dichotomy, I guess, between those two sorts of experiences.
Yeah, no, and I want to address a couple of things that Lou brings up in the chat. First on Diablo, having only 6 buttons makes rotations a variety a bit harder. I was going to have to pick up a few skills that support and power up 1 or 2 core attacks. I think it's actually true. Like, I think Diablo wants you to have 1 generator, 1 spender, and then 4 once in a while things, right? That you pick mostly for their ancillary benefits, or like for like big, like, like in Barbarian, this would be like Fatal Strike, right? Like something that just like is a damage bomb that you're not hitting all the time. On Street Fighter, Lou says, is Blanca using more than 1 move yet? I will tell you, I believe the guy's name was Menard. He was used, like, people don't know how to deal with balls quite yet, but that is pretty the strong Blanca balls, which like it's one of his classic moves. But there was some high level play at CEO. It was the finals was a Blanca versus Jury, and the Blanca was pretty dominant. I recommend going to watch it if you're curious. And then I'm back on Diablo. Lou says, my fight against Butcher made me question my abilities hard. No skill into Sun's skill needed is no fair. Yeah, I think Butcher's a little bit like, have you, like, the Butcher was like a weird encounter for me too. Like, it felt like it required a lot more out of you than anything else did. But, that's the weird thing I find about Diablo. Is like, it feels much more like raw numbers checks than anything else. But back to your
so there's some stuff that I do think is mechanic. A butcher I do think is an exception, right? I think I can outplay a lot of things, and I think I'm dealing with mechanics appropriately by moving around or whatever. But Butcher has this issue where he's just wailing on you. And like, either you beat the damage check or you don't. And I think that is unique to Butcher, right? I feel like if you don't have a solid build, you will get destroyed by Butcher by just the numbers, versus if you don't have a solid build, you'll get destroyed by bosses because you get overwhelmed over time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes some amount of sense. Like that was my biggest problem with Duriel, I think, when I fought him, is that like there was a point like late in his 3rd phase as a melee character, it's hard to dodge his attacks because he stops like doing the things where he stands still, so doesn't attack you for a couple seconds, and so you have to like be able to like tank a certain amount of hits in order to even do damage, and that always feels weird. And also, like, Diablo doesn't feel like a game like this is a thing that's also maybe an interesting comparison point to WoW, right? Like, up until basically this game, resetting your build in Diablo was not as much of a thing, but it feels like maybe the game wants you to tailor your builds a little bit more to specific encounters.
Yeah, that I think is interesting. The tailoring your build, because there's some stuff that just literally doesn't matter, or that matters in esoteric ways, I guess. Which is interesting.
Yeah, but like my point being, right, like I'm fighting Duriel, I might want to swap out like like Whirlwind for something like not Hammer of the Ancient, Upheaval, because I can get a little bit more distance on that and not have to worry about eating a hit. Or like I might want to switch to my double-handed weapons because I can get the attacks and dodge out faster. So I was basically getting carried by friend of the cast, Monic. I was like level 50, he was level 70. He's like, let's do Torment 4. I'm like, what? And basically me standing there and trying not to die. But part of that was that, like, when I was using my 2-handed weapons, the swings were so slow that I couldn't get out of the way in time. And at that, I'm so fragile at that stage. So like, I can switch those things around, and maybe switching weapons isn't the worst thing. But the other half of that is maybe a little bit like switching points I think feels a little bit worse, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the interesting thing I think is the disparity between bosses and packs, right? In Diablo, I am really strong at dealing with packs, but I'm not super strong at dealing with bosses. And because part of this is that one of the stats I value very highly is damage versus slowed, right? Because I'm using the two-handed sword, right? I'm putting bleeds on everything, and then I have the thing that says stuff that you have a bleed on is slowed. So, and then also I have the thing where, you know, I have a bunch of thorns. When stuff takes thorns damage from me, it gets a short bleed. So I'm basically always slowing everything around me at all times, and damage versus slowed is a really powerful stat for that reason, right? Whereas if I was playing like a lightning sorcerer, right, damage versus slowed would be a terrible stat. It wouldn't do anything. But on a boss, that stat doesn't mean anything because bosses can't be CC'd, right? Same thing with damage versus stunned. A big thing for me is being able to, you know, foot stomp, and then right now I'm using upheaval. So like foot stomp upheaval is a really powerful combo of mine because that stuns everything, and then I get a huge bonus versus stunned or whatever. But again, versus bosses, you don't stun bosses that often. You have to build up that stagger bar, and you only have this kind of like short window to take advantage of it. Whereas mostly what I'm actually trying to do is kind of like take advantage of it at all times, right? And I think that that's a pretty interesting sort of like, are you building for bosses? Are you building for packs? How is that going to work?
Yeah. Um, yeah. No, that's absolutely true. But this is talking more about kind of like individual game mechanics. I think we want to bring it back out to like the more
Yeah, that's true.
the meta stuff. So like it sounds to me like your objection to playing Whirlwind Barb is less about it being meta and more about it being just like a thing you're not a fan of.
Yeah, and I also think I just want to say that my default position, I think most people's default position is that they don't want a meta, right? They don't want like BIS mentality, right? Like they don't want you know, they don't want to be dictated to how to play the game. They want to make their own choices, right?
Yeah.
So just on a basic level, you know, player A interacting with game one, right? Whatever that interaction is, you can already assume there's going to be a pretty heavy weight towards, I'm going to do my own thing, right? Which is part of why the question I'm asking is, what makes a meta good, right? Because I feel like if a meta is good, right? Like the Hearthstone meta right now, to be fair, I've been playing a lot of Hearthstone right this second, but I am assured that the Hearthstone meta right now is actually really amazing. People really, really love this meta, right? In Rage Warriors, the best deck in the game, it is, I think it's the only tier 1 deck right now. But so few people are playing it that it doesn't feel like a meta. It doesn't feel like it's dominating the meta. People are actually playing worse, like, or more often playing these worse kinds of tier 2 decks. And when a meta is all tier 2 decks in Hearthstone, that's actually a really good meta because it means that everybody has good matchups, everybody has bad matchups. But fundamentally, most people, you know, like good pilots will be able to get to legend by playing the decks that they like, and you know, and making really strong plays out of that, basically, right? Um, and and so that question of what makes for a good meta, why would a meta be good versus why a meta would be, you know, would be bad, I think is part of what drives this discussion, right? Because the meta is always something you need to be persuaded into, I guess is my point, rather than the default. I think it's comparatively rare to have someone who starts playing a game and goes, ooh, let me, you know, instantly go look up the best way to build my character, right? I think a lot of people end up in that place. I think a lot of people who play Diablo, right, for instance, will end up going to the Diablo subreddit or to some builds website, or they'll be watching YouTube content or something along those sorts of lines. But I think that they opt into that experience later down the line. I don't think that anybody really starts from that place. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much like I definitely like I think I agree with you for most people, but like I think there is definitely a type of person who is more focused on winning because that's how they get the joy out of the game, and they are willing to run to the meta thing because they are more concerned with winning. That like this is like, you know, this is you use the magic psychograms, right? Like there's like Timmy, Johnny, Spike. Spike, I think, is less concerned about is like likes having a clear meta because then he can go get a good deck, right? Like, and you know, there's like to your point, a good meta versus like a bad meta isn't always just like, you know, like Spike isn't concerned about the quality of the meta. He's concerned about the existence of the meta and his ability to go find a a tier 1 type deck, right?
Yeah.
In either case, because he's interested in winning, and that's fine, right? But I think you're generally correct, right? I think people enjoy, although I don't know. I think there's also like kind of like a shaky middle ground there. Like I know that for me, I like bucking the meta intentionally. Like that's just like a thing that brings me specific joy. Is like winning through odd ways and like doing
Yep.
things that aren't exactly like considered viable, right? And that's got a lot more purchase in say Magic and a lot less purchase in something like League of Legends, right? I've done it, right? But it's generally to the chagrin of my teammates who want people to be like not necessarily like in lockstep with like what it's being played at Worlds, but want people to be within the kind of general contours of the meta. If
Oh
that
yeah,
makes
this was a very frequent thing when we were playing League because that was another meta where I wanted to be not, slavish to the meta in the sense like only playing strong champions or whatever, but there is a and this is maybe what I was getting at with the WoW point thinking about it. There was a sort of framework meta as well. That was a piece of this, right? Which was, oh, you put a mage mid lane and you have sort of this mage do this. You have characters who are synergistic with one another on a team comp, right? You have you have champions in the jungle who are going to be able to move to the different lanes and gank for you, right? Be able to relieve pressure and help you kind of get back into things when that like these are all pieces of the League of Legends meta that aren't just this champion is overtuned, that champion is undertuned, right? They're kind of fundamentals to the teamwork of the game. I would say that meta is something I was slavishly devoted to because it's sort of like playing a game of baseball and saying, oh, well, for this game, we're not going to have any outfielders. We're just going to play 9 infielders. And it's like, that's fucking bonkers. I hate this. Just do your job.
like
You know what I mean?
The meta essentially, right?
Yeah.
But there are several layers to this, right? Like in the chat, Lou says AP sign and 80 miles maybe want to die every time. Like those are specific character metas, right? That are like off limits. But like to your point, right? Like there were times we were playing where certain like classes of characters were generally more meta, and like that was like a little bit more medium term, right? Like when we were playing in the tank meta, that favored putting a tanky person top lane. That didn't necessarily mean like you had to do it every time, and people would be like, I'd say like you get some pushback if you're playing an off mid-level meta versus an off an off base level meta, right? Like if you chose Nasus when Darius was the biggest, the most meta champion, people wouldn't complain. If you played, would be an example of like a non-tanky top laner, like a Teemo maybe, right? Play Teemo, Teemo might give you a little bit more pushback. If you said we're going to do a top lane, then people start to push back more because that, like you said, that breaks kind of like the fundamental meta, right? Because that's like that breaks kind of like the more solid meta. And so I guess that's maybe a place to look at. Like, I mean, I think part of what makes a good meta is you have to have enough flexibility that like you have options. Because I think part of this is like it's a fool's errand to try and completely eliminate a meta, right? The only way you get a completely balanced game is to make the game incredibly boring. Right? Like you basically make your choices kind of non-existent. That or you have to have like a very small decision space, right? Like,
I would actually say that there are a lot of games that don't have metas, but that is because they are like. So I'm thinking of Rain World, right? Rain World doesn't really have a meta, but like the mechanics aren't built around that kind of level. Like in Rain World, just surviving is kind of the challenge, and there's not enough expression for you to have different. There's no ability tree, there's no skill points. You have to use everything in your kit all the time in order to barely not die in a game like that, right? And similarly, Super Mario doesn't have a meta. There's no meta to Super Mario Brothers for the NES. Every version of Mario is quote unquote built the exact same, and generally speaking probably takes like the same kind of like route to get to the flag. It's only when you would maybe impede or like impose other aspects on top of it, right? For instance, there would be a speedrun meta for Super Mario Brothers, but I don't think that there would be, I guess, a meta to a game like that. Does that make sense? Does that track?
Yeah, I think it mostly does. I think I think the Mario example is trivial again. I think you're mostly right about that just because there's not really a way to change, right? Like
Yeah, I guess that's probably what defines a meta, right? You have to have the presence of alternate strategies where someone makes a conscious choice to do one over the other for that like
yeah,
strategic benefit.
and they can't be like obviously like directly superior, right? Like I could describe to you a meta of Super Mario Bros, which is like pick up power ups, right? Like, but like there's like rarely and like I bet you I could make a case for like say Super Mario Brothers 3, right? Like which is more powerful, the Fire Flower or the
Oh,
Raccoon Tail, right?
yeah.
Something like that. But like those are like such minor decisions, right? Like it's also like a solved game, right? Like it's not like you have to like adapt at any point in time, right? So you can kind of figure these things out. Um, but like yes,
Yeah, like similarly in Rain World, you can hold up to two items, one spear and one of something else, and there's a bunch of different items in the game. You could maybe say, "Oh, it's a rock meta because you always want a spear in one hand and a rock in the other," versus, "Oh, it's a berry meta because you want a spear in one hand and a berry in the." It's like, no, it's like unreal, right? Compared to something like Diablo that is much more, you know, straightforward, I think.
so Lou in the chat brings up Mario 2, which is like an interesting point, right? Because have you played Super Mario Brothers 2, the American
I
version?
do not, but I do know of that because Super Mario Brothers 2 is famously right. Like the story behind that is Buck Wild, where they took this completely other game and they sort of retrofitted Mario onto it from Japan. So it's the part it's he's like throwing fruit
Yeah,
and
yeah.
shit, right?
It's
Yeah.
because they thought that Super Mario Brothers 2, like the real one, was too hard for American audiences.
Yep.
But like the point there is like you pick one of four characters, and the characters all have different kind of like slightly different properties. And Lou says different characters for different level types is a thing, and that's kind of true. But like it's also like every level is beatable by every character, right? So like yes, I will agree with you, Lou, that there is a pick a certain like there are ones that will make it easier, but like that's also like a much more mind like you don't need to go to the internet because like I think this is part of it too. It's like you need to have some sort of like scaling topless kind of thing to act towards, right? Like a
Yeah.
faster time or like a higher rift level or whatever.
Yeah, because here's another one. Assassin's Creed. I was like, is it just RPG mechanics? Because everything is RPG mechanics now, right? Whereas in the
Yeah.
past they didn't, right? So one of the things about Rain World, there's no RPG mechanics. There's no level up. There's no experience points. You never make a skill tree. And I was thinking, and I was like, maybe that's a piece of it, right? Because the way you build your character. But there's no such thing as a meta for an Assassin's Creed game, right? Because that game is entirely insulated to your like representative single player experience, or any of these other
Yeah,
kinds of like
I'm
single
sure
player
there's
open world games.
I'm sure there's a weaker meta, right? Like I'm sure you can like go to like Spiffing Brit, right, or some other like YouTuber who builds their content around like absolutely breaking a game, and like that is like a meta style thing, right? Like you're picking abilities that like work together really well in a way that like trivializes some of the game, but like it's not thought about in those terms,
Yeah,
right?
also I would say at higher difficulties you probably encounter a meta. For instance, in Dragon Age 2, right?
Mm.
The first time I played Dragon Age 2, I just did whatever I want. But when I got to the higher end difficulties, I can't even remember what the top one is called, like brutal or something like that. You do sort of need to have particular builds for your characters, because if you're not using they had a whole system for certain enemies apply like a debuff and then other enemies activate the debuff. So the one that I remember was one of your guys could freeze someone, and then your mages could freeze someone, and then your warriors could do a slam that did 400% damage if you broke the freeze condition. I think it's called the brittle condition, right? So the whole meta for doing like the hardest version of that game revolved around this level of gameplay. You had to do it, because if you didn't, that was like you wouldn't be able to like complete the experience. So that is actually kind of interesting. I've never thought about like creating a meta before.
No, but see that's an interesting point, right? Because like people like I think if you ask somebody whether that Dragon Age meta was good or bad, you get a variety of answers because some people enjoy the aspect of that. It's basically it's solving an optimization puzzle, right? Like some people enjoy that. Some people are like, I hate that. I want to be able to build a character in the way I want to play, right? And there's that second one is always kind of a sliding scale, right? Because you can't always
Yep.
like you need some level of optimization, otherwise, like you can't have any skill synergies, essentially, right? And that's unsatisfying on a different vector. But like that's why it doesn't get talked at like the quality of that as a meta doesn't really get talked about versus something like League or Hearthstone, where essentially I think the values there are like options that you can pick from that are all like you know moderately fun. Like I bet you that one's a little bit more of a sliding, like like how fun is it? How fun is it to play versus how brain dead, right? Like I remember early in Hearthstone, it's like face is the place, right? Like the meta that favored like just going face. That was like a completely brain dead deck, but like some people enjoyed playing it. I don't know how people will consider that good or bad. If it was an option, I think people would think it was fine, but like an option where like I think an option where like a complicated deck dominates is more acceptable to people than when where a brain dead deck dominates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that is true. So there are a couple pieces of this. One, for instance, when a control deck is the best deck in the game, those are brutal metas that people hate. And it's very common actually to hear that in Hearthstone circles. Everybody wants a control meta in the sense that they want a slow meta where you're hitting turn 10, people are kind of building around a certain kind of value options or whatever. But the reality is a true control meta really sucks. What you really want is you want a powerful, aggressive top end to your meta. You want the best deck in the game to be some form of aggressive deck, typically, or just some form of tempo deck. Aggressive kind of has different connotations. But you want to have a lot of like really viable control counters to that, right? So if let's say the best deck in the game is Face Hunter, right? That's actually typically pretty good because when the best deck in the game is an aggressive deck, it makes it so you have a pretty clear counter program where people build control decks, and control decks are winning because they're farming Face Hunter, right? Even if they're losing to one another or they're losing to mid-range decks or all these other kinds of things. That tends to be pretty fun. When the best deck in the game is a control deck, though, all you do is you make every game last 45 minutes, and everybody fucking hates it. They want to pull their hair out.
Yeah, no, I mean, but that's interesting because that's like an answer. Like people hate that meta not because in something inherent to like the meta-ness of it. It's because of the ancillary concerns, right? It's like because control decks take forever to win, right? Like
And also the deck type that beats control deck are combo decks, and combo decks are very unfun to play against if you are a control deck. It is typically really like if I'm playing a control warrior and I know I'm going up against like let's say a combo. I don't know. I can't even think of like a good combo deck like this, like a combo warlock or something like that, right? Um, that just always feels bad because you're on a timer, you're on a clock, and the only option you have is to somehow disrupt one of their key combo pieces, right? And while I would say that's actually pretty fun, it's part of the fun that made my Quest Hunter deck really fun back in the day because I was playing against a bunch of combo decks, and the perfectly timed ice trap was just like the best thing in the world if you just got this level of disruption down or whatever. But yeah, that is all specific to Hearthstone, but I do think it kind of speaks to kind of like the underlying mechanics of how some versions of a meta are good and some are bad. For instance, a version of things where walking arsenal barbarian, right? The barbarian where you're switching weapons all the time, which is more or less the version that I'm playing right now, is the best version of barbarian, is one where I probably would be happier with the meta. It is that the meta is bad because the bar build is bad, like we were talking about before.
yeah, and also like I know that you don't personally like, but do you know what the sense is of kind of like the larger world about like the barb meta right now? How do people feel about it, right? Like because like I said, I know Whirlwind is historically a favorite, right? Like
I guess I have to say that I expect people like it because when I looked into it, every build was like this, right? And when I was talking to my friends about this, they were talking about it in that. So, like, I was talking to one of my friends. She was like, I just want to cast Blizzard. I just want my whole build to just be constantly freezing shit and casting Blizzard, and you guys blow them up. And I was like, that sounds awful. I hate that. But sure, I guess, right?
yeah, I
Um,
guess I guess so. So this is maybe a fundamental thing about Diablo, right? Like Diablo doesn't care how you kill an enemy, right? You don't get better loot if you have a complicated build to kill something, right? You get the same loot
Yep.
as someone, your 7 buff weapon swapping bleed build gets the same loot as the guy who just like holds down the right click and is wee right like
This is like ruining Diablo for me, Mango. You're like gonna make me uninstall this fucking game. God, you're so right. Have I just been a fucking moron? Like, because like there was a thread that actually really appealed to me. I want to bring up this thread because I thought it was really smart. It's from Hamlet, who's an old WoW designer, now works at Riot. I don't actually know what are your pronouns, buddy? Fuck. Why are they not in the bio? I think she's trans. She might not be trans. She might just be non-binary, but we'll go with it. So Hamlet says, D4 is remarkably resistant to playing by net decking or best in slot mentality or whatever you want to call it, because it's both difficult and largely ineffective to play by aiming for a specific build endpoint and beelining to that. And I think that it's like a hard thing to pull off. And she goes on to talk about how, the custom, the web of synergistic interactions is really complicated between skills, passive talents, legendaries, paragon choices. They all affect each other, and the value of almost anything is dependent on like, can I fit in these other pieces to it, right? So a good example of that would be my thing with slows, right? I valued percent damage to slow a lot because percent damage to slow is triggered by all of my bleeds inflicting a slow, and I have spec'd into all of this bleed stuff, right? But someone who hasn't kind of like built that way isn't going to be looking for the same sorts of things. And that's just like one version of the interaction, right? It's an interaction that goes everywhere. So for instance, if someone has a really coherent, tightly working build and you replicate 60% of it with what you have, you probably have something silly, right? Some of the stuff that you're including is probably pointless, and some of the stuff you're leaving out might be way better for you, right? Which is to say that like, because those builds are so synergistic, it's actually kind of hard for me to build out of what I'm currently spec'd into. Like if I wanted to go for a whirlwind build, right? Well, I mean, I don't know. I do think whirlwind actually does include bleed and damage to slow or whatever
Right.
else. But like, let's say I was going to go for a Hammer of the Ancient power build, which I don't think is a real thing. Let's just say I would go for it. I'm probably not looking for percent damage to slow because I'm not looking for bleeds. I'm looking for overpower. I'm looking for fortify, right, which also contributes to to overpower. I'm probably looking for a set of stats that are completely orthogonal, right, to the set of stats that I've currently kind of optimized for. And then she says, item customization is very expensive. Yeah, you can imprint the 10 legendaries you want onto your 10 best items and have the perfect build, but you won't be doing it for dozens of hours. You have to disenchant multiple legendaries for every one you imprint, which I also feel like is very true, right? Like I have a lot of aspects at this point that are like good aspects, but they are kind of a cherished resource. Typically what I'm thinking about when I'm popping up an aspect is I get a really good rare drop and I want to like upgrade the secondaries on one of my like items to another, and so I'm going back and I'm finding the old aspect, or I'm like ripping the old aspect to kind of like put it on. And so they continue, the only way to get by is working with what you have until your items are really stable, and it's almost certainly worse to rip apart and recombine all of your items to try to poorly approximate a YouTube video compared to using your best items and building good support for them, right? Which I think is pretty interesting. I would probably say that that's actually a really good design philosophy in a way, right? Diablo probably wants a version of things that looks like when something drops, you make an evaluating choice where you say, does this work for my build or does it not? And if the answer is yes, you can like subsume it into what you're currently working with and tinker with your build, if not necessarily like rebuild entirely. It's for instance, it's pretty common for me to rebuild around certain uniques or legendaries that drop. I had a unique that was using the chains, the steel grasp or whatever. But then I replaced that with with a legendary. And when I did that, I was like, okay, well, I don't need steel grasp in my build anymore. I can pull this out, right? And then all of a sudden, my helm, which had 3 ranks of steel grasp, I'm like, oh, I should actually probably replace that, right? And now I'm looking at my helm, and I replace my helm with something else. And now, and that is kind of how my builds have sort of morphed over time, right? Um, and the result of all of these kinds of like pieces of things, right, is built on, some of it is synergy, some of it is friction, right? But it ultimately kind of creates, I feel like, a game where I'm encouraged to buck the meta and sort of take what I have and make the best of it, right? A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush sort of mentality, right? Which I think is neat, which I think is interesting. Do you feel like that is, in keeping with like a like good game design and meta building and stuff like that, or
So
what are
I
your
think
thoughts?
that's a good ideal, but I also think that it's a balancing act, right? Because like there's also a version of this, and I think that this happens to some extent, at least in Diablo 4, where like all of that is like nice to haves that kind of get like the flip side of that is that like you are aiming towards a whirlwind build because that's what you want to build, and you just kind of ignore everything else. Like you like let it like some of these secondary stats they come out in the wash, right? I don't care, right? Like I don't care about um the marginal like secondary stat, right? Like lightning resistance versus shadow resistance, who cares, right? Like one rank of like, kick that I'm never gonna use, whatever, I'm because like and some like because it always has to be that balancing act because otherwise you're completely beholden to your items, right? Like you can imagine a system that maximizes the things you were just talking about, and at that point you actually don't have any choice either. You have to just play to whatever your items have, right? Because like otherwise you're not going to be effective either, right? Like you have to build a whirlwind build because you got the whirlwind legendary, and I think that's like I think you're right that like that design philosophy is correct. It's just hard to nail, I think, and also it's one of those things where like we've talked about this a lot in terms of WoW, where like
Yep.
no matter how you design it, people are gonna do whatever they fucking are gonna do, right? And a lot of times that is like slavish devotion to whatever somebody decides, whatever the collective consciousness decides is the best, right?
Yeah,
Um,
there's also a thing of like, this is a corollary in her thread where she says the current cottage industry of game guides and videos seems notably ill-suited to dealing with a game like this. You can see YouTube videos every day saying new amazing, class build, but all they really cash out to is these are the last 3 good items I found, which to be fair is kind of true. Like this has been my experience,
yeah,
right? Whenever I've looked at a video, right? Like for instance, I just watched one by Crip, who's a Hearthstone guy, but he's doing stuff. He's talking about the pure summons necromancer, right? If you want to make a summons necromancer, how do you do it? And the answer is you get one unique, and then the unique says sometimes your summons blow up for 18,000 damage. And it's just like, okay, get an item. That's that's the build. All right, sure, fair enough, kind of thing.
yeah.
And
I
I
mean,
feel like what can you do about that piece of the puzzle?
yeah. But that's the other part of it too. It's like it makes it like if you want to play the summons build, right? Like you have to either be set like you have to either grind for that item or just be like whatever, like I'm like accept that like you're not gonna play that. And I don't know, like I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, right? Like I think a version of Diablo where you're constantly switching up your build to match your items is fun in its own way, but it also kind of like I think doesn't match a lot of players' expectations. And maybe that's why Whirlwind's a popular build, right? Like let me think about like the pieces there are like Branks on Whirlwind on some piece, right? Like, um, actually, this is probably why like one skill builds are the kind of more favored ones, right? Because you can kind of target a single skill, right? And like you'll probably find a legendary that does something with it, right? There's like a half dozen legendaries that interact with Whirlwind, right? And then you just pick your other 5 skills based around your items, right? And that's probably why Blizzard and Whirlwind and like these and Corpse Explosion are all popular builds because you can target that one thing and build everything else out around it. That makes sense
I
to
would
me.
actually say a different. I think packages is really what it comes down to. So in Hearthstone, when we talk about decks, we talk about packages a lot of the time, right? Which is
Right.
to say that like this is a group of cards that you can include in your deck, but it is not necessarily the entirety of your deck. So for instance, I had in my Control Warrior build that I was talking about, there's the Rift package, which is 6 spells and then 2 Naga Giants, right? Which is a total of 8 cards. And I swapped out the Rift package for the weapons package, right? Which added in 4 weapons, 2 Abyssal Basists, and just 2 other guys who are weapon synergy kind of cards, right? And I think that a lot of the time when I'm looking at metas, it really boils down to the strength of individual packages, right? Which is something that, funnily enough, Brian Kibler once made a video about. He made this video like 4 years ago. He made a video and he was talking about one of the problems with Hearthstone at that particular time was the strength of certain packages, right? And he was talking about how like basically every deck I ever make has to include this package because it is the best thing. And I can kind of do whatever I want with my other cards, but like the most of the time the whims I'm going to be pulling out are going to be these wins, right? The package he was talking about at the time was using a certain activator and then a kind of whirlwind. This is like an old Enrage sort of build for warrior. And it's just like once you have this risky skipper package, you can kind of do a couple of different things that you can do a bunch of different things you want with it, right? But at the end of the day, it's risky skipper that's winning you the games, and we could just call this risky skipper warrior, and you could have 50 different versions of it because risky skipper wasn't like the thing that was the flashy part of the deck, but it was the part of the deck that was allowing you to control the board, generally a lot of value and tempo, right? Swing, have big swing turns and win the game off of that kind of thing. And I feel like a similar thing is probably true for Whirlwind because what's funny? I have seen it is not just Whirlwind, right? If I go to d4builds.gg, which is the site I was using for this, right, you can actually see, and it's funny because they're all stacked on top of each other. There is Whirlwind Endgame Barbarian, Rend Endgame Barbarian, Hammer of the Ancients Endgame Barbarian, and all of them include those 3 shouts. So maybe it's just that the shouts package is really good at efficiently generating you a ton of fury, and the best way to play warrior, the best way to play barbarian is to just generate a boatload of fury and constantly be spamming a score skill and never using your basic because you don't need to generate fury when you're just using shouts on cooldown. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes some sense to me. I also think that you stumbled on something important, which is important for a good meta, which is this kind of like 3 levels of meta we were talking about when it comes to League, right? Like the ability to like, even if there's like a powerful kind of like top level meta, like adjustability to kind of like make it your own, right? Like you were saying, right? Like the core, warrior meta, what is that? Is it Control Warrior that has like the Rift package versus the weapons package?
Oh yeah. Yep.
Right? Like Control Warrior is there, right? And there's a net deck for people who enjoy kind of just like pure, net decking, right? But you can get the joy, like, the joy of like, I've made this my own by swapping out that package, right? Similar thing in League, right? The kind of structural meta of the lanes versus kind of like the particular seasonal meta of like what character is strong. You can still express individual choice in there by choice of hero, build within that hero, that kind of thing, as long as it's within like kind of like constrained parameters, right? Similarly with Diablo, right? Like I am like, probably at endgame shouts are all the best thing, but I am sure as people are leveling, they're like playing Whirlwind, but they're adjusting their other 4 or 5 skills along the way, right? Similar, and I think this is the big insight here is WoW made the changes that WoW made to talents made it much better from like a meta standpoint, because while there are overall things you are doing, especially within kind of like the lane of like single damage versus AoE versus a couple other things, you can move a couple of points around and not totally and like get most of what you need and like still be able to like express individually some stuff, right? Like, I play Monk. I don't play the exact build on Peak of Serenity. Maybe Monk's a little bit more flexible than other classes, but like I like Phalanx Stomp, so I pick Phalanx Stomp. I'm pulling a couple of points out of other places to do that, but it's not totally ruining my ability to perform. I think that's an important thing, right? Like the ability to kind of like tweak things on the meta that you want and not have it totally fall apart.
Yeah, that's definitely true, because also in WoW, that is something that I prioritize a lot, right? Like in our Mythic Plus group, I do a lot of the single target damage, and that's important. Like, okay, to back this up, something that I watch worse Mythic Plus teams than ours do, right, is what happens is you have 5 people who aren't behaving like a team when they build their comp, essentially, right? You have a group of people who have all come together and they have looked online to see what is the best Mythic Plus build for this class, right? Oh, Mythic, best Mythic Plus Fire Mage, right? They take that talent loadout, basically, and they pull it into keys. But the thing that'll end up happening is when a specific damage type or profile is sort of needed or required, they can't adapt to it because everything is just sort of built for raw overall DPS, if that makes sense. And so you never get any of the contours of like, oh, well, actually the hardest pull in the dungeon is going to be this mini boss before the final boss, right? And he does a thing, and you actually need somebody who does a lot of execute damage, right? Because his damage ramps up or whatever. Or maybe it's 2 mini bosses and you just need to do a lot of cleave, right? And so having everybody kind of specced into what does the best for 5 target AoE is actually kind of a detriment, because what would really have made your group better is to sort of do what ours does and say, okay, this one person is going to be built for single target damage, for cleave damage, for burst AoE maybe, right? And then this other person is going to be dealt built to just kind of farm these 5-person packs or whatever. And having that kind of flexibility that keeps your overall damage profile relatively even, so that your group is kind of putting out the same amount of DPS on every single pull, rather than having a situation where your group is like putting out wildly different amounts of damage based on the type of pull it is actually really like beneficial, right? And I do think that that's actually kind of an interesting kind of contour. I like that a lot. I would actually kind of say, I don't know, it's complicated, obviously. What It's interesting because there exists a sort of mini meta under like a top level and a sort of ordinary meta, in a sense that I'm kind of describing, right? Which is the top level meta, you just take the most powerful shit. This is like what, the what are the Mythic Plus things called?
Keystones.
God, what's the man? I can't remember what the esport is called. It is Keystones, but it's just like, um, man, I don't remember. They have like a Keystone League, right?
Okay.
MDI is what I'm thinking.
Okay.
The Mythic Dungeon Invitational. MDI players are just going to play the very best, and typically they are so good that they can just fucking pull the entire dungeon. And the only thing that they do is they bring classes that have massive uncapped AOE damage, because that's how you time keys as part of the MDI, right? Whereas the under us is kind of the pug meta, and the pug meta is sort of what I'm describing. You have 5 people who have individually built their characters to the specifications recommended by guides. Those specifications recommended by guides are universally talking about doing flat AoE damage to groups of 5 individuals, right? To like a pack of 5 characters. And in between those is you have us, right? Where we are pushing, we are pushing high-end keys, we're pushing 20s or whatever else, but we're not doing it as part of a pug, we're doing it as part of a dedicated team environment. And as part of that team environment, one of the advantages we get to flex is the fact that we have a consistent comp who can handle certain things in certain ways in a consistent way. And I think that that's actually pretty interesting to kind of like work around, right? The different ways that the same game mode can create individually unique metas depending on how the group of players are interfacing with that game mode.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, again, to bring it back to League, right? It's like, there's a tank meta, and you're probably playing, a tanky character that can kind of, or like in a kind of like a normal meta, right? You're playing a character that can individually perform on its own and not have to rely too much on your teammates, because, you never know who you're going to be teaming with. But when we're all playing together, you can play like a character that's a little bit more supporty, right? Like in our games, right? Like Buddy's playing Yasuo mid. Okay, everybody pick someone with a knockup. Buddy will carry us, right? Like that,
yeah.
That kind of, like, even if like say Nautilus isn't particularly in the meta right now, that ult that does a knockup, that's valuable enough that like it makes it worth it, because it will mean that like Buddy's Yasuo will go off. and it will work, even though the other team is playing every like the same team that got played at Worlds, they are all playing individually and don't know what they're doing, right? Like that kind of thing.
Yep.
Or I mean, that's actually the top level.
Well, I've described my favorite moments with League of Legends were during Clash, for instance, right, where I was on the team. I was playing in mid lane. They saw that Yasuo was my most played champion. The first game they banned it out. The second game they let it through, and we first picked it, right? And we built a Yasuo team, and we stomped that game or whatever, right? Like that was the individualized meta of this is a clash. I can see what my opponents play in the clash and who they're good on, and my bans are about respecting who should or should not be kind of like picked or countered, right? Whereas like in a ranked solo queue environment, you have no idea what the enemy team is playing, so you're banning out meta champions, right? In a lot of situations where you're just saying, oh, whatever, Master Yi is the most gross broken thing in the meta, let's just ban him every game so we don't ever see him. I know we had a version of that. I can't remember who. We're just like, I never want to see this character.
I mean, that was Charles with Yasuo.
I guess that's fair. Yeah, that was Charles with Yasuo.
Yeah. But that was I mean, I was thinking about it too, because there's also like metas that are like very ground level, right? Like we had a local meta for like the 12 of us that used to play, right? It's
those
like
in-houses, yeah.
Which was based around our particular talents, right? And like also our particular anti-talents, where it's like, leave Cyan open. Rohan might pick it and play AP Cyan. That'll make it easier. That kind of thing, right? Like,
or, like the idea that like you want, you don't want your best player going up against their best player. You want your best player going up against their worst player so that they can farm a bunch of kills in the laning phase, right? Like,
yeah, man, we used to have on this podcast where we just, I think you mentioned it's like, at some level, I was the determining play, like how I was doing was determining how the team went, just because I was like,
technically, yes, that was maybe the black pill moment for me on League of Legends. This is when friend of the cast Charles once insisted that he was as good of a player as me. And I took that personally, okay? And I sat down and I went through our entire match history together for like the whole season or whatever, because this was back when you could look up your whole match history on like there wasn't even like op.gg back then. It was like on the League of Legends website. Yeah, and I just started charting out the wins and losses, right? And I did prove what I wanted to prove, which is that definitionally I'm the better player, right? I almost always had a positive KDA, I almost always high in CS and had the most gold on the team and all this other sort of stuff. But the thing that ruined this exercise for me, the thing that just destroyed me about this fucking exercise was I realized me doing well never contributed to a win, right? The deciding factor for whether or not we won or lost the game was whether or not you had done well in that game. If you had a positive KDA and you'd gotten some kills or whatever, we were cruising, we were sailing, we were winning that game, right? But if you were getting farmed, getting wrecked or whatever, that was a game we tended to lose. And so even though Charles tended to lose when he was playing League of Legends, and I tended to win when, in our respective kind of lanes and roles and stuff like that, neither of that didn't matter, right? We won plenty of games with Charles fed. We won plenty of games where, I got fed, but the determining factor, right? The actual decision point, the thing that was winning games, was how you played. And I was just like, wow, this sucks. This is
well, to be fair, that's kind of like a weird, it's like a correlation, not causation thing, right? Like, cause like you doing well was contributing to, like, you playing at a high level is like what gave us the baseline. It's just kind of like, that was like, I'm like the indicator, right? Like if we were against a team that was better, like I was like kind of like the midpoint. So if I was falling below, that meant that our whole team was like a step below. And if I was above, it meant that our whole team was a step above. It wasn't.
Yeah. That is definitely true. It's funny. I think about this with Hearthstone stuff sometimes because I'll look at stats like drawn win rate, played win rate, right? And you will see cards that have really high played win rate, right? And it's like, oh, this is the best card in the deck. right? But really what that card typically represents is a win condition, right? So for instance, in let's say in an old Control Warrior build I used to run, I had one card that was a like it was a 6 mana 6/6, but if you did it right, it was a 12/12 with charge, right? And my played win rate on that card was really, really high, right? Which is to say that most games that I played it, I won that game, right? But the problem is that the drawn win rate was actually much closer to 40. It was like 40%, right? Because the reality was, yes, when I got the opportunity to play that card, it typically won me the game. But that's because I had positioned the rest of my deck around getting to that point. And if I wasn't in striking position, it's a pretty bad card to play. So if I wasn't in like a striking position, it's actually just kind of a dead card in your hand, right? And like analyzing the stats along those kinds of levels can give you like different sorts of kinds of insights. Yeah, yep, I totally
Yeah,
get you.
yeah. No, I mean, and you know, that's yeah, no, that's huh. That's an interesting thing to think about, right? Like, the thing that pops into my head is like win more cards and like also like that picture that's like very popular on the internet now of like the airplane with the red dots on it because it was
Oh
like
yeah.
because like you know like it's a survivorship bias point, but the point is that like the indicators don't always indicate what exactly you think they mean, right? Like
Yeah, the common thing, this is the air it's an airplane coming back
World War
from
II,
bombing in World
World
War
War
II, right? And the aeronautical engineers looked at the bullet holes and they say, "Oh, we need to reinforce the armor here," right? And then someone pointed out, "No, the fact that it came back means you need to reinforce the armor where there are not bullet holes, because the implication is if there were bullet holes in, I think it's like the engine, the rudder, that kind of stuff, then the plane goes down, right?"
but yeah, it doesn't come
And I,
back.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Uh,
yeah, that stuff is really interesting, and I think about it a lot when it comes to Hearthstone, because like an interesting thing with Hearthstone is you need to have power at different points in the game, but like those things swing wildly. So for instance, in my Control Warrior deck, there's a card called Trench Stalker. Trench Stalker has won me more games than any other card in that deck, right? It is the game-winning card. And the reason why, it is a 9 mana 8/9, right? But the buff style, you know, where I'm, you know, one of the buff cards is all of the creatures in your deck, all the minions in your deck gain stats equal to their mana cost, right? That turns it into a 17/18, right? Um, and another one that says double the stats of all minions in your deck, right? The point of Trench Stalker is it sits in your deck. You play these cards. When you draw it, you are drawing a 9 mana 17/19 with the text Battle Cry, attack 3 random enemies, which typically includes the enemy hero. You attack the enemy hero for the win, right? But if I draw Trench Stalker in the first 4 turns of the game, it is god awful. It's so bad, right? Because it's not sitting in my deck. It's not waiting to get buffed, right? The first turn I can do a buff is on turn 5. Second time is on turn 7 or whatever. So now it's just a 9 mana 8/9 that'll attack 3 random things and probably kill itself in the process, right? And so it's about finding the different, and this is actually maybe foreshadowing for when we end up talking about Estrella. It's about finding the right density of synergy, right? Cards that power up one another when they are played together, without dilute or without like diluting your deck such that the synergy becomes kind of untenable, right? In Hearthstone, if I have cards that are keyed off of armor, for instance, right? The Shield Slam is a powerful piece of armor removal. It deals damage equal to your armor to a targeted enemy minion. Shield Shatter is the same thing. 10 mana, 5 damage to everything, right? But it's reduced in cost by the amount of armor you have. I have to have armor cards in my deck in order to support those 2 cards, right? But if I don't have enough armor cards, then those cards get proportionally worse, right? Because the synergy isn't there. And I feel like the kind of underlying math and strategy behind those is really, really fast.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. But that's I think the appeal of those of like a lot of deck builder games, right? Is like switching out little pieces. Whereas something like the other games we've been talking about, Diablo and WoW, it's not as much about kind of like those individual pieces. Partially because they're also like a little bit harder to quantify, right? Especially given with the tools that you have, right? Like it's very like that's kind of the advantage of like a deck builder style game is like you can like know pretty concretely what each piece of your thing is doing, right?
Yeah, in WoW, I feel like the questions are much more about sort of how much. So, for instance, there is a version of my build that I can play in WoW that is raw damage the highest it could possibly be. Right, every point in my talent tree contributes some level of damage, right? But the reality is that nobody would ever do that. Nobody would ever take that, right? Because there is a weird damage breakpoint where I would rather have utility, and so I'm thinking specifically for the warrior talent tree. There's a talent called sidearm. Sidearm is probably like 0.3% of my damage in a raid encounter, and I take sidearm just because kind of there's not a better thing to spend it on. Just says every once in a while when you auto attack, you deal a little bit of extra damage on that auto attack. Okay, fair enough. But in my Mythic Plus build, I don't take that talent. I take Stormbolt, right? Because the utility of having a 4-second stun on a 30-second cooldown is so much vastly more important than the combined amount of damage. Like I'm not timing a key because I did an extra 400 DPS, right? But I probably am timing a key if I can interrupt a like really dangerous ability with a stun when I, at range when I need it with Stormbolt, that kind of a thing. And I feel like that is a similar calculus in the sense of you are looking for, like you are in that instance, you're sacrificing some synergy, right? I'm sacrificing a little damage synergy in order to pick up like a core piece of utility. But it is the same sort of like question of like at what break point am I willing to make that decision, right? So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, we're well over the hour. We've kind of gotten away from meta talk a little bit, so I think that was a good discussion. Obviously, we didn't come down to like a ton of like definite things there, but I think it was a fun talk. Yeah.
Agree.
All right. Well, tell me how your week was then.
How my week was. What have I been doing? Mostly playing Diablo.
Yeah.
The big thing I'm doing in Diablo is I'm filling up my renown. I'm getting renown on everything. I did all of the altars of Lilith. I did. I'm doing a bunch of dungeons. I maxed out on 3 of the 5 zones. I'm just getting closer, plugging away at it or whatever. To be fair, I actually really loved the altars of Lilith. I had a lot of fun doing those, but like I had a lot of fun in the way that like I don't know. I was listening to a ContraPoints video. She's talking about AI. It was pretty funny. I could have the map of where the altars of Lilith are on my other screen. I didn't have to like, it's like that's just good. That's just good times. That's just fun.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's that's the mode of play sublimation, right? It's
Yeah,
kind of like
yeah. It was definitely sublimation. I mean, I was doing other stuff. I was playing Astrea. I've been playing a lot of Astrea recently, but I don't know how much I want to talk about it.
Yeah, I believe I am not allowed to talk about a lot of my play of Astrea. Yeah, but yes, I played the demo, which is public, so I could probably talk about that. Demo's great. Same as it's a similar one to the one that was at PAX, right?
Yeah, I think it's had. I don't think there's anything mechanically different about the demo. But it's probably had VFX and stuff.
Yeah, I think
like polish added in.
Yeah, I'm not gonna say anything else because I'm worried about confusing different parts of things. But it's a fun game.
Yeah, I played Astrea on stream as part of Steam Next Fest, which was pretty fun. My Solarius build was insanely good. I got a really powerful Solarius build that was a lot of fun. But my Mooney build, I actually I whiffed. I think it's the first time I've ever lost an Astrea run on stream. I famously have said that I'm the best Astrea player in the world.
That might be true.
Exactly. Just because like nobody else has played. I said it as a joke during the completionist stream, but it's kind of like caught on. And so I was playing Mooney last week, and I just kind of like whiffed a little bit, and I made some tough decisions. One of the things that is not in the demo but is in the full game that I was showing off at the time is the anomaly levels, right? Which is the game's progressive, difficulty. And I was playing the maximum difficulty I'd unlocked at the time, which I think was anomaly 5, right? And it was very funny because Leo was in the chat. Leo, the designer of the game, was in the chat, and he watched me make some dumb mistakes, right? One of the anomaly levels puts a bomb on all of your guys, so whenever you fully purify an enemy, that bomb goes off, deals 1 corruption. So if you are at 1 health and you fully corrupt someone down, they will explode and deal the 1 damage to lose you a heart. And I was like, no, I can't believe I made that mistake. But the second time that we went in, I was able to win on Mooney. And then my Solarius build was actually really shaky and dangerous at first. I lost a bunch of hearts just because I couldn't, because like the build couldn't support it. But once I kind of got going and got my engine together, Leo actually said that he was like, this is one of the most powerful builds I've ever seen. I was like, yeah, buddy, let's go. So,
Yeah,
that's some stuff.
That's a very fun game. I'm very much looking forward to the full release. I'll be there day 1. What else? I've been playing a lot of Street Fighter. So
how is Zangief doing? Is in the meta? Is he good? Is he bad?
So this is it. So he's not the worst, right? I think the worst, the commonly thought worst character right now is Lily Hawk. But Street Fighter tiering tends to be weird, and also I still think the meta's still forming, right? Like the game's been out for 3 weeks. It'll be a while before we kind of like settle into a true rut. But something kind of in general that you could say is, you know how you said like people hate a control meta? People tend to hate a grappler meta, right? Like grapplers tend to not ever be top of the meta. Yeah, so Lou says in the chat, seems feast or famine. All it takes is a few hits and you win. This is why people hate grappler metas, right? Because 1, it's like you guess right 75% of the time and you still lose. And 2, it just work fundamentally differently. So like the primary triangle in fighting games is attack, block, throw, right? Block beats attack, attack beats throw beats block, right? Most of this is actually not focused around like the grab is not like your standard grab is not actually used as much, right? It's mostly about like different normals fighting each other. When you're kind of just like trading normals, it's called footsies, right? That's kind of where like the soul of the game lives. And because grapplers live a lot, like grapplers mostly live on throws or like the threat of throws causing people to screw up, and this thing called 50-50s, which is like 50, like the concept of 50-50 is you put someone in a position where they have to guess, right? Like, because if they guess right, they get out, and if they don't, they get thrown, right? Or they get hit, right? And that is how like most grapplers live. And this is part of why I like grapplers, right? It's like if I have the fucking read, you're fucking dead, right? Like I know you're gonna jump, and I like input the jump grab, you're fucking toast, right? But that is also can be incredibly frustrating. So I kind of get it. The other side of this is zoners who are not hated as much, but get kind of like the same thing because they also work a lot differently than other characters. They stand back and they fill the screen with shit and they don't let you get in, and that can be incredibly frustrating. It is in kind of like the larger meta triangle, right? Like zoners are really bad for grapplers because grapplers have a hell of a fucking time getting in against like zone. They have a hell of a time getting in against anybody, and against zoners, it's just even fucking worse. Like your traditional zoner is Dalsim, and then like JP is a very powerful one in this game. But it's so like that's kind of like the state of like fighting games meta in general. Like I said, I'm not sure how like this is a pretty grappler heavy game. There's like Lily Hawk, who as I mentioned is generally looked down upon, but like Manon and Geef I think are pretty okay. Lou in the chat says she's Manon is a grappler that has a power up, so you have to stall that shit out. Manon's interesting because like once she's fully powered up, she has like the best normal throw in the game, right? She beats like at 5 medals, and like this buff persists between rounds. Your normal throws throw harder than Zangief's hardest throw, which is interesting. She also has like a vacuum effect, which is like a thing borrowed from basically other fighting games that like kind of like lets you pull people in and like makes the kind of like getting in aspect a little bit easier. So it's a super interesting game. I like it a lot. I like because like there's a lot of characters like their own individual mechanics, right? Like Rio's still your everyman, right? But like one of the and like the new there's like the kind of like three kind of core normal characters I will say are Ryu, Ken, and Luke. Because Luke is not like he doesn't have like the same like lore implications as like Ryu, right? He's not using the same energy, but he kind of plays like when he's got an uppercut. He's got kind of like a Russian thing, which he's got a sandblast, which is basically like a fast Hadoken. Um, Lou in the chat says they made Ken actually good and they hate it. Boo to Hobo Ken. Funnily enough, friend of the cast Akshay was always a Ken player, but had been playing Ryu in the more recent iterations. He's back on Ken. He's very happy about it.
Hell yeah.
But like Jamie, I think Jamie's super interesting. I don't play him, but like his thing is he drinks, and once he gets 4 drinks, he kind of like transforms. But his gameplay is based around getting you in combo strings to give him enough time at the end to take a drink. That way he can kind of like unlock his full potential. And it's also just like a super fun game to watch, right? Like I'm getting super into it. I enjoyed watching the CEO stuff over the past couple of days. I enjoy watching matches. I'm taking kind of like my lab time seriously. It's been a great time.
That is actually pretty fun. It's funny how applicable to Hearthstone all this stuff always sounds.
Yeah.
Even though they are radically different games, I would probably say they are like almost as far apart as games can be. Like
I don't think that's actually true, right? Like Street Fighter has the execution component, but there's a lot of kind of like X beats Y, right? Like you don't have the builder component either.
Yeah,
right?
I guess that's true. I'm just thinking about like I have all the time and I have all this time to think about my
Right.
Hearthstone plays, which is different than like getting frame by frame stuff that's happening in fighting games. But that thing you said about reads is so. This is why Quest 100 was so fun for me, because that the mastery of that deck came down to reads, right? Oh, when do I play my traps such that I am going to get the most amount of disruptive tempo, right, to close out, to close out games. And when I got those really powerful reads, it just felt fucking amazing, right? Another good example of this is I have other reads. Like when I was playing Menagerie Warrior, there was a while I was playing Menagerie. And I would get these reads about when I could drop a one amalgam band. And the point of that deck is to play just one amalgam band to 6/6 that has all the keywords, essentially. You build it up over the course of the game by playing a bunch of different things. But it's just like, it's very common to play that card and it gets destroyed, right? But like you need to know when you can thread it in, and you're like, oh, I have a window here. I can get it in. I can essentially Reno myself to full health, and I have this huge threat on board that I know that they can't deal with, and boom, that's a win, right? Or another version of this is maybe like getting reads with like Trench Stalker stuff, right? In the Control Warrior deck is super fun, because just like there are games where I can just win the game by drawing a 20 mana taunt, or I'm sorry, a 20 health taunt that the opponent can't target with spells or abilities, and you're just like, I win. You can't recover from this, right? Getting those kinds of reads, those kinds of plays, knowing when you sort of shuffle up, oh, I'm going to win the game by doing this thing is actually like, I don't know, that's fun to me, but that sounds sort of like if I have the read, then I win. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and it's not a win as much in Street Fighter, but like, very common thing for me to do is, so Street Fighter 6 has a thing called throw loops. Throw loops are if I throw you, I have enough advantage after the throw to walk up and throw you again before you can do anything, or before you can get an attack out. And so you either have to dash back or jump or do something that like keeps me from grabbing you again. And so like a lot of my game plan is like start a throw loop and then like read when they're going to jump and then like do my level 1 super, which is like a jump in the air, grab them and slam them on the ground. Or something like that. And when I get it, it's just like, oh yes, I knew you were going to do that. I got you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like dictating the initiative, right? Is in chess. Is this when you are the one who is dictating the term? You are acting, your opponent is reacting. That's when you have initiative. I feel like that is a really fun feeling.
Yeah, I mean that's a fundamental part of fighting games, right? Like it's when it's your turn, right? It's like I have come out of this exchange and I have priority, right? I have the frame advantage, so I like you have to react to me. Um, Lou says throw loops and corner juggles, fun interactive gameplay. Being on the receiving end is the worst feeling ever. But this is why it's frustrating, right? It's because it's all 50-50, right? Like you have to, make a guess as to what's going to happen next, and like react appropriately, right? Because like one of the responses to a throw loop is you input your own throw input, and it does the it's called detecting a throw. You kind of like slap each other's hands and you push back. And for a grappler, that's actually pretty good for the defender because you've put space between you and you kind of like reset to neutral, right? So that works. But it is what it is. It's.
Have you been watching anything cool recently?
I finished season 2 of The Boys with my girlfriend, which was interesting. But I feel like we should wait until I get to the end of season 3 to really talk about that.
Okay.
Let's see. Like my biggest complaint about like the thing that always stuck out to me the most about The Boys is like this idea that like the military doesn't have superheroes. I'm like, no way in hell, right? Like there's going to be some super who like loves his country, right? Like, and you can even like play this up, right? Like he's like, goes and would enter the military because he feels it's his duty, right? Like there's definitely somebody like that exists, and the world's just a little too cynical for like. It's not that it's like it's definitely too cynical for my taste, but it's like too cynical for like my suspension of disbelief.
No, yeah, this is what I was talking about when I was like, there's no way to keep this secret. Like that's unreal. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And the other thing too is like this is gonna sound a little harsh, but like the way they mix politics is like I can tell it's part of the original comic because it's something that like an edgy Reddit atheist would have said in 2006, and I can tell it's part of the show because what a like edgy Reddit like left poster would like post in 2018, right? Like or 2020, right? So, but it's
this is why I say this. It doesn't. It's actually dumb as fuck, right? No thoughts head empty. Rocks for brains. There's nothing underneath the surface.
It's still a fun watch. Like I'm still enjoying it, and like I'm still involved in it. It's just
that's the distinct. It's compelling. It's such compelling television. I feel like.
Yeah, and I also got spoiled on something. Somebody I followed on Twitter posted a panel, and so like. I don't know if it's happened in the show yet, but I know who Black Noir is, assuming they keep it the same between the comic and the show.
What could
like Black Noir's identity?
I don't. Black Noir is a part of season 3, and you learn about his backstory, I guess. But like,
oh, interesting. Maybe they changed it for the show.
Is he? Yeah, like if he's someone specific, I maybe don't know this.
Oh, yeah.
The Boys is a particularly bad comic book that I don't like and have never liked. So this is one of those like comics things where I don't actually have a fucking encyclopedic knowledge of like all
no,
of
I mean,
lore.
If it is how it is in the comic, it'd be very obvious. I mean, I suppose they could change it somehow to like make that reveal later, but in the comic, he's I don't want to spoil it for people listening at home, but in the comic, he is.
Oh, okay. I actually just spoiled it for myself. Interesting.
Yeah. So I'm curious how they handled it in the show. But yeah. Otherwise, have you watched anything good?
I watched anything good? You know what's funny is sort of like related to this. I was watching a bunch of conspiracy stuff. I don't know. I've been watching a lot of I don't want to like talk politics or whatever, but I was watching a bunch of like conspiracy stuff about like flat earthers and QAnon and other sorts of conspiracies, and it was generally, it's just fun. Like those videos. I don't know why I can just eat them up so effortlessly.
Yeah. No, I mean,
yeah.
There's that one guy who's running in the Democratic primary who he's a weird one.
Well, yeah, and so the other thing I was thinking I was paying attention is the sub stuff. Where like the Titan submersible.
Oh yeah. That, I mean, that captured everybody's attention. What was the My favorite tweet over the weekend was like, "Time to take off my submarine expert hat and put on my like Russian mercenary expert hat."
Yeah, because Putin's chef fucking rebelled against him or whatever. Holy shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. The submarine stuff was so funny. Did you see James Cameron talk about it? Holy fuck. It was the
Yeah.
most like satisfying thing. The submarine story is honestly kind of dumb in like I don't actually think that there's anything there outside of just like the sort of raw. Do you know actually let me put it this way. Do you know what liminal spaces are?
Yes. Yes, I watched the Super Eye Patch Wolf video on it.
Oh, you know,
Yeah.
it's actually funny. I do know Super iPad Force, but I haven't seen his video on it. But ContraPoints made a video
Okay.
on liminal spaces. And she was sort of talking about how liminal spaces have this same sort of genealogy with thalassophobia, which is like the fear of like
The deep ocean. Yeah.
the insane depth of the ocean. And I just feel like that's what this is, right? Like it is this sort of overlap of the uncanny, eerie sort of confrontation of how deep the ocean really gets out there. And that's why it just like, I don't know, it just like became a thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like it's like all meta takes, right? It's like, how you feel about it, how it compares to other events of like, of like similar nature.
Yeah,
right?
like
what that says
my
about
interest.
society. We live in a society, buddy.
Yeah, there's definitely people who are like, yeah, fucking billionaires or whatever, right? My interest is entirely the doomed boat. I'm part of the doomed boat fandom. I was just like rattling off these facts to Rachel. She was like, what the fuck? Because like, I don't know where I picked all this up from. I just know about a lot of doomed boats, I guess, right? Like the USS Indianapolis is a famous one. It's the one that, it is the United States cruiser that carried the atomic bombs, so it was radio silent, and it gets sunk by a Japanese submarine, and nobody knows that it was sunk because it was radio silent, obviously. And so I think it was like 3 days. Right? The entire crew was basically stranded in the middle of the ocean for 3 days, and then sharks showed up and fucking feasted on them, and it was just like, doomed boat stuff, like. The other one that I got really into, doomed boat knowledge was absorbed during your Titanic history phase. It's all part of your Cameron billing. True, honestly, right? The Terror is a doomed boat, is a famous doomed boat. Doomed boats, weirdly
like the
enough,
Northwest Passage is like a doomed boat generator, right? Like,
yeah, yes, of course. Weird doomed boat is also Chernobyl. And I know that sounds ridiculous because it is a landlocked nuclear power plant, but I would say that there is a shared history between those two guys that I'm obsessed with who looked at the open reactor of the Chernobyl reactor, melting down, and that was the thing that killed them. There's something about that and doomed boat that shares common cause in my brain. They are inextricably linked. I also got really into, do you know about compression divers?
is this like related to the bends? I don't know about it specifically.
Okay, so this is a profession. You can be a professional compression diver. What a compression diver is, the two fucking guys in Chernobyl. What a compression diver. So yes, it is related to the bends. The reason the bends happens is because you shift pressure, right, too quickly, right? Somebody who is a scuba diver can dive actually pretty deep and then come back up, right? Your body can adjust to like massive changes in pressure. But one of the things that people figured out is that if you do that process slowly, your body can adjust to extreme differences in pressure, right? So what a compression diver is they basically live at super extreme pressures at all time for typically days or weeks on end in order to do their work. So for instance, at an oil rig, right, a compression diver would be on an oil rig off the North Sea, and they will be 300 meters down, right, under just a ton of water, right? But because they acclimate to that process slowly, they go into these tanks called compression tanks, right? Where the pressure is slowly, increased over time, and so they're living at whatever it is, like 20 psi, whatever the number is, right? And they will live in these diving bells. So there'll be a ship up top, and there's a diving bell, and they'll dive down out of the diving bell, out of the compressed diving bell, and do their work at the bottom of the sea where the welling is happening or whatever. But the that is obviously an extremely dangerous set of circumstances, because being a compression diver means that you're like, if anything goes wrong, if there are any like problems, you're in extremely like extreme danger. So for instance, there was an oil rig in the South China Sea, where there were a group of compression divers who were doing stuff at the bottom of the well, and a typhoon came. And the boat had to essentially do like kind of an emergency evac to go to shore because it was too dangerous to be. Actually, they were on an oil rig technically. So the compression divers come up, and they get put in a compression tank. The compression tank gets put on a boat, and during the typhoon, the compression tank was essentially jettisoned because it was going to sink the boat. And so those guys are in a tank, and they're floating to the bottom of the sea. They're dead. And it's just like, oh, the thoughts of that. The most heinous one is the dolphin, I think, is something like that accident, which was a group of compression divers who were on the surface in a compression tank, and they are at the height of their compression, and someone accidentally opens the door, and there is explosive decompression where they are living at 20 psi, and all of a sudden all of they're instantly at 1 psi, so their bodies just exploded from the inside out. And it's just nightmare fuel, Maga. There's a million stories like this.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, if you made me pointed a gun at me and told me either do the, I mean, I guess if you pointed a gun at me and choose either one of those, I'd let you shoot me. But like, if you could force me to, I'd say, like, I'd rather die instantly than like, live with my doom at the bottom of the ocean. Yeah. That's
yeah, tell me about it. There's also like not unhorror stories, right? There's actually a guy who, so they have like umbilical cords essentially, right, like to their suits or whatever. There was a guy whose umbilical cord got snapped because the wind at the top of the thing was pulling the diving bell around, and the cord got caught on a piece of machinery and just like went taut for a second, and the whole thing snapped, right? But because of the crazy sort of like thermodynamics and physics and chemistry of being a compression diver, he actually sat still for 30 minutes on one breath of air, right? And survived until they could get down there and reset their position and rescue him. And it's just it's crazy. Compression divers are nuts. Anyway, doomed boats. That's what I'm talking about. That was
so my like Terror's version of this is it's like an astronaut who like lets go of the spacecraft, isn't buckled in, and just like is slowly floating away, and like because you can't swim back, like you can't swim in space, right? There's nothing to push against, right? Like you're fucked, right? Like you could be like 3 feet out and you're fucked, right? Like it's that's like the type of thing that like gives me nightmares, right? Like that in this fucking boat, right? Like the idea of sitting in a tube like that for 10 minutes terrifies me, much less like 10 hours, right? Even if this thing is successful, right? Like,
yeah, I know. I mean, Hank Green wrote a thread about what implosive compression, right? It's the opposite of explosive decompression would be implosive compression would have been like, right? And he talked about how the air would have been moving so fast that it would have formed plasma, right? Just because like it's under 4,000 psi. It's like you cannot comprehend. It's like every square inch of your body takes 2 tons of force in an instant. How you just can't. Yeah, it was funny because I saw a picture, which was a dumb picture of somebody. People were talking about the game controller, right?
Yeah.
And there was a picture of the game controller at the bottom of the sea or whatever. And someone was like, the cheapest part survived. And I knew, I obviously knew that wasn't real, right? But the thing that I realized, the reason I knew that wasn't real, I was like, there's no game controller left. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that is a thing that is built for 1 psi that has just been crushed into literal smithereens, right? And then like the very next thing I saw was people talking about finding the wreckage. They found the wreckage exactly where you expected it. it looked as though there was some problem, an implosion happened or whatever, catastrophic implosion happened, and someone was like, there isn't a plan to search for remains or to like rescue remains, and I was like, what remains?
Yeah.
Like, what the fuck is gonna be left? They're smears on a wall at best, right? Like,
Yeah, the thing that I saw that like kind of like really like so somebody did like the science experiment version, which is like you take an empty can of soda, you put it over a burner on the stove, and then you flip it upside down in a pot of water, and the thing is instantly like thumps in it. It's obviously, and that's like, several orders of magnitude less dramatic than what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, or like, I mean, have you ever seen implosions happen on train cars? Is a thing that happens in train cars, because when you're pumping chemicals in and out of a tanker car, right, you have to pump in air as well as pump stuff out. But what
Right.
people will, you're a railroad worker, you'll forget to do this or something like that, and what'll happen is the whole train car will, because the crazy thing about it that I didn't realize at the time is that it's not a slow process, right? It is a tipping point process, right? Where everything is fine right up until you meet a critical threshold, and then that threshold is crossed, and it's, you know what I mean? And so there's huge, like cars, like these tanker cars, and they just crumple like a soda can, right? And it's just like, I can't deal with this, man. Oh,
Yeah.
Christ.
Yep.
Some terms talk about horrible ways to die. Listen, don't get me started on serial killers, okay? That Mindhunter was a trip.
I'll say, obviously it'd be terrible to die in like explosive decompression or whatever, or like explosive compression, right? Like implosive compression or whatever you said. That at least it's like instantaneous, right? Like when I found out about like the sub like imploding, it was like, well, at least they didn't suffer, right? Like, they didn't, that's infinitely preferable to
the nightmare everyone was thinking was that they lost power or whatever, the sub sank to the bottom of the ocean to like get out of that, right?
Yeah, or like,
but that obviously, yeah.
Like they raise the sub and it turns out they have murdered and eaten the sea. Like, they murder, like, you're in that situation, you murder the CEO. He put you here and he's taking your precious oxygen, right?
Yeah.
Like, just like terrible nightmare scenarios, right? Like Donner Party level scenarios, but like in like a much worse, like, you know what? We should stop.
I feel like we're like falling down like the podcast like rabbit hole, because like true crime is like all podcasts, right?
Yeah.
I saw like a stat on this. There was like 44% of all podcasts that people to are true crime podcasts, and the next closest one was like 12%. I was like, the fuck? Holy shit. There's a lot of people listening to true crime, but yeah.
You know what, Lou? That's
industrial furnaces.
Oh, this is like live leak. So this so I don't know if you remember, but back in the heyday of live leak, it's just like, this appears to be a Chinese factory. Turn off the video now, right? Like, just because like, safety standards are low. It's like, oh, here's like a molten metal squiggling about like it's like it's like silly like a silly string, because some mistake happened, but it's molten metal, and like if you're lucky, the video doesn't show what happens. Like, there's no like human toll to that, right? Like, it's
or where it's like it's so fuzzy because the resolution is always terrible. It's just like unimplied. Like you're watching like at a steel foundry, one of those huge crucibles is like being whatever, but then like one of the bolts fails and the stuff cart starts like falling or whatever. I'm describing a real video. I don't know why I'm not doing this. But like, and all you see is there is a black smudge that might be a person, might not be a person. The molten metal sweeps it off camera. What happened there? Who knows? I don't, and I hate it. Do not get him started on some French bullshit. I'm sorry.
You know what? We're gonna end this here.
We're gonna end this here.
All right. If you'd like to email us about anything we talked about on this podcast, whether it's about metas or people dying horribly, you can reach us at subderpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@subderpsplaygames.com. You can follow us at twitch.tv/subderpsplaygames or youtube.com/subderpsplaygames, where these go out live. You can rate, review us wherever you can find podcasts. There's links all down in the description. Buddy, you have anything you're looking to promote?
I do just want to mention that Steam Next Fest is going on right now, and both Estrella and Ever After Falls have demos that are up. The demos are up until actually the Estrella demo I think is up until the game is live at this point. Just because we're getting close. But I would recommend playing the Ever After Falls demo. It's a lot of fun. It's a normal, wholesome experience. Okay, so
No
you're
explosive
doing
decompression.
no explosive decompression in this one. It is good times with your little cat. He helps you do farm. It's great. I'd highly recommend it to anybody of the Stardew Valley persuasion. Just the complete opposite, the complete opposite of everything else. So yeah, that's the only thing I want.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to say until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.